The armored cruiser was a type of warship of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was designed, like other types of cruisers, to operate as a long-range, independent warship, capable of defeating any ship apart from a battleship and fast enough to outrun any battleship it encountered. Varying in size, it was distinguished from other types of cruiser by its belt armor, thick iron plating on much of the hull to protect the ship from shell fire, much like that on battleships. The first armored cruiser, the Imperial Russian Navy's General Admiral, was launched in 1873 and combined sail and steam propulsion. By the 1890s, cruisers had abandoned sail and took on a modern appearance. For many decades, naval technology had not advanced far enough for designers to produce a cruiser which combined an armored belt with the long range and high speed required to fulfill its mission. For this reason, many navies preferred to build protected cruisers in the 1880s and early 1890s. It was often possible to build cruisers which were faster and better all-round using this type of ship, which relied on a lighter armored deck to protect the vital parts of the ship. However, by the late 1880s, the development of rapid-fire cannon and high-explosive shells made the reintroduction of side armor a necessity. The invention of face-hardened armor in the mid-1890s offered effective protection with less weight than previously. In 1908, the armored cruiser was supplanted by the battle cruiser which, with armament equivalent to that of a dreadnought battleship and steam turbine engines, was faster and more powerful than armored cruisers. At around the same time, the term light cruiser came into use for small cruisers with armored belts. Despite the fact they were now considered second-class ships, armored cruisers were widely used in World War I. Most surviving armored cruisers from this conflict were scrapped under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which imposed limits on warships and defined a cruiser as a ship of 10,000 tons or less carrying guns of 8-inch caliber or less, rather smaller than many of the large armored cruisers. A handful survived in one form or another until World War II. Background: armor, guns and engines. The armored cruiser was developed in the 1870s as an attempt to combine the virtues of the armored ironclad warship and the fast and long-ranged, but unarmored, cruisers of the time. Such a ship was desirable to protect overseas trade and, especially for the French and British, to police their vast overseas empires. The concern within higher naval circles was that without ships that could fulfill these requirements and incorporate new technology, their fleet would become obsolete and ineffective should a war at sea arise. Concern over obsolescence in official circles was further fueled by the race between the increasing size of naval guns and of armor strong enough to withstand such fire. In 1860, one of the largest naval cannons in standard use had a bore of 8 inches and fired a 68-pound solid shot or approximately 51-pound spherical shell. By 1884, guns with as wide a bore as 16.25 inches, firing an 1,800-pound exploding shell, were being mounted on naval vessels. This gun could penetrate up to 34 inches of wrought iron, the earliest form of naval armor. These were muzzle-loading guns, as had been used on ships from the 1500s. Breech-loading cannon, which were readopted into naval use in the 1870s, were more destructive than muzzle loaders due to their higher rate of fire. The development of rifled cannon, which improved accuracy, and advancements in shells were other factors. Although a cruiser would not likely face the largest caliber guns of a battleship and many navies commonly used smaller weapons as they did not wear out as fast as larger ones did, cruisers still needed some form of protection to preclude being shot to pieces. The adoption of rolled iron armor in 1865 and sandwich armor in 1870 gave ships a chance to withstand fire from larger guns. Both these protective schemes used wood as an important component, which made them extremely heavy and limited speed. The key factor in a cruiser's ability to perform its duties satisfactorily while the first ocean-going ironclads had been launched around 1860. The station ironclads built for long-range colonial service, such as the British Audacious class and French Bellicose, were too slow, at 13 and 11 knots respectively, to raid enemy commerce or hunt down enemy commerce raiders, tasks usually assigned to frigates or corvettes, powered by both sail and steam, but without the additional weight of armor. These ships could reach speeds of up to 16 or 17 knots. The most powerful among them were the British and Constant, the U.S. Navy's Wampanoag and the French Duquesne. The British especially had hoped to rely on these vessels to serve the more distant reaches of its empire. In the aftermath of the Battle of Hampton Roads in 1862, where United States wooden warships were defeated by the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia, the Admiralty realized that its ships could theoretically encounter an ironclad in any theater of operation. Ship propulsion was improving but was also taking time to develop. Naval engines in the 1860s were single-expansion types, in which steam was expanded into a cylinder, pushed to piston and was released. Compounding, where steam is passed through a series of cylinders of increasing size before being released, was a more efficient process. It allowed the steam to generate more energy and use less coal to go the same distance. With greater efficiency came increasingly complex machinery and the larger potential for breakdown. However, advances in metallurgy and engineering, the potential for smaller bunkerage and the successful use of compounding in commercial engines made it an attractive option for naval engines as well. By the 1870s, compound engines had become standard for warships. Compounding by itself did not increase power or speed significantly, although it allowed for a much greater operating range. Forced draft systems would help increase power and speed but would not come into use until the early 1890s. 1870s. First armored cruisers. The Russian Navy became the first to produce an armored warship intended for commerce raiding, with the General Admiral, begun in 1870 and launched in 1873, often referred to as the first armored cruiser, armed with 6 8-inch and 2 6-inch guns. She and her sister Gerzog Edinburghsky were not fully armored but protected only by a narrow belt along the waterline. This belt, moreover, was so heavy that it sat below the ship's waterlines, which limited its benefits still further. Since they were iron-hulled, however, they were more durable than their wooden counterparts. With a top speed of only 12.3 knots and a high coal consumption, which necessitated a full sailing rig, they were not really suited for the role of cruiser. Nevertheless, these ships were considered a new threat to British commerce in the event of war, the rationale being that any vessel, regardless of its speed, could technically be a threat to overseas commerce. The British responded with Shannon, begun in 1873, launched in 1875 and armed with 2 10-inch and 7 9-inch rifled guns. 2 ships of the Nelson class followed, armed with 4 10-inch and 8 9-inch guns. These early armored cruisers were essentially scaled-down versions of the first-rate ironclad warships of the time like their Russian counterparts, were essentially belted cruisers. Past this belt, the designers placed a 3-inch armored deck, situated deepest in the ships, to guard magazines and machinery against plunging fire. Above this deck, space was allocated for coal bunkers and storerooms. These areas served a twofold purpose. The bunkers served as added protection, since 2 feet of coal was considered the equivalent of 1 foot of steel. Also, if either of the ships became flooded from battle damage, it was hoped the contents of the bunkers and storerooms would aid in their continued buoyancy. Because of this unarmored protection, these ships could be considered the first protected cruisers. However, these ships also shared the liabilities of the Russian ones, and because of this, the British Navy was never happy with them. Shannon's top speed of 12.25 knots and Nelson's of 14 knots made them too slow to deal with fast cruisers, and they were not armored well enough to take on a first-class battleship. Their armor belts also sat below the ship's waterlines, which made them of limited benefit. The underlying problem with these early warships was that technology had not caught up to the demands being made of them. Therefore, they represented a series of compromises and could not be fully effective. They were typically powered by double-expansion steam engines fed by boilers which generated steam at perhaps 60 or 70 psi pressure, which gave relatively poor efficiency and short range. Even with improved engines, the dearth of overseas refueling stations made a full sailing rig a necessity, as sailing ships required a high freeboard and a large degree of stability. The use of armored turrets as used on monitors and sim battleships was ruled out, because a turret was a very heavy weight high in the ship and its placement necessitated a lower freeboard than was warranted for an ocean-going vessel. Consequently, armored cruisers retained a more traditional broadside arrangement. Their armor was distributed in a thick belt around the waterline along most of their length. The gun positions on deck were not necessarily armored at all. The limitations of these ships would not be rectified fully until decades after their construction. Meanwhile, a battle in May 1877 between the British unarmored cruiser Shah and the Peruvian monitor Huáscar demonstrated the need for more and better protected cruisers. Shah and the smaller wooden corvette Amethyst hit Huáscar more than 50 times without causing significant damage. The Peruvian ship had an inexperienced crew unused to its cumbersome machinery, and managed to fire only 6 rounds, all of which missed. The engagement demonstrated the value of cruisers with armor protection. 1880s. Rise of the protected cruiser. During the 1870s, the rapid increase in the size and power of armor-piercing guns caused problems for the designers of battleships and cruisers alike. Even a ship designed with adequate armor protection from the current generation of guns might be vulnerable to new guns powerful enough to penetrate its armor. Consequently, naval designers tried a novel method of armoring their ships. The vital parts, engines, boilers, magazines and enough hull structure to keep the ship stable in the event of damage, could be positioned underneath an armored deck just below the waterline. This deck, which would only be struck very obliquely by shells, could be thinner and lighter than belt armor. The sides of the ship would be entirely unarmored but would be as effective as an armored belt which would not stop shell fire. Cruisers designed along these guidelines, known as protected cruisers, superseded armored cruisers in the 1880s and early 1890s. As mentioned earlier, the armored cruiser Shannon was the first ship to make use of an armored deck. However, by the end of the 1870s, ships could be found with full-length armored decks and little or no side armor. The Italian Italia class of very fast battleships had armored decks and guns but no side armor. The British used a full-length armored deck in their Comas class of corvettes started in 1878. However, the Comas class were designed for colonial service and were only capable of 13 knots speed, not fast enough for commerce protection or fleet duties. The breakthrough for the protected cruiser design came with the Chilean Esmeralda, designed and built by the British firm Armstrong at their Ellsworth yard. Esmeralda, with a high speed of 18 knots, dispensed entirely with sails and carried an armament of 2 10 inches and 6 6 inches guns. Considered very powerful for a ship her size, her protection scheme, inspired by the Italia class, included a full-length protected deck up to 2 inches thick, and a cork-filled cofferdam along her sides. Esmeralda set the tone for cruiser construction for the years to come, with Ellsworth cruisers on a similar design being constructed for Italy, China, Japan, Argentina, Austria and the United States. Protected cruisers became attractive for 2 reasons. First, the concept of the armored cruiser was not embraced wholeheartedly in naval circles. Second, several navies were caught in a race between armor thickness and the size of main guns and did not have the money to spend on battleships and armored cruisers. The use of smaller, cheaper cruisers was a better alternative. The French Navy adopted the protected cruiser wholeheartedly in the 1880s. The Jeune École school of thought, which proposed a navy composed of fast cruisers for commerce raiding and torpedo boats for coast defense, was particularly influential in France. The first French protected cruiser was the SFAX, laid down in 1882, and followed by 6 classes of protected cruiser, and no armored cruisers until the Depuis de Lima, laid down in 1888 but not finished until 1895. Depuis de Lima was a revolutionary ship, being the first French armored cruiser to dispose entirely of masts, and sheathed in steel armor. However, she and 2 others were not sufficiently seaworthy, and their armor could be penetrated by modern quick-firing guns. Thus from 1891 to 7 the French reverted to the construction of protected cruisers. The British Royal Navy was equivocal about which protection scheme to use until 1887. The large Imperieuse class, begun in 1881 and finished in 1886, were built as armored cruisers but were often referred to as protected cruisers. While they carried an armored belt some 10 in thick, the belt only covered 140 feet of the 315 feet length of the ship, and was submerged below the waterline at full load. The real protection of the class came from the armored deck 4 in thick, and the arrangement of coal bunkers to prevent flooding. These ships were also the last armored cruisers to be designed with sails. However, on trials it became clear that the masts and sails did more harm than good. They were removed and replaced by a single military mast with machine guns. The next class of small cruisers in the Royal Navy, the Mersey class, were protected cruisers. But the Royal Navy then returned to the armored cruiser with the Orlando class, begun in 1885 and completed in 1889. The Navy judged the Orlandos inferior to protected cruisers and built exclusively protected cruisers immediately afterwards, including some very large, fast ships like the 14,000-ton powerful class. However, the Orlandos were the first class of cruiser to use the triple expansion engine. Because this type of reciprocating engine used the steam in 3 stages, it was more fuel efficient than earlier compound engines. It also used steam of higher pressure, 60 pound-force per square inch, as compared to the 25 to 30 pound-force in earlier engines. With these engineering developments, warships could now dispense with sails and be entirely steam-driven. The only major naval power to retain a preference for armored cruisers during the 1880s was Russia. The Russian Navy laid down 4 armored cruisers and 1 protected cruiser during the decade, all being large ships with sails.